Namaste, and welcome to tonight's Vichar Manthan event, where we will be delving into how we as a society relate to the matter of death and what Dharma could offer us in this regard. My name is Daksha, and I will be your chair for this evening. For those of you who are new to the platform, the name Vichar Manthan, or VM for short, is a Sanskrit phrase which translates to the churning of ideas. So, as the name describes, the platform is here to spotlight those ideas that are most pertinent to British society and evaluate them through the lens of Dharma. Another way to describe Dharma is to say that which sustains. And we do this by engaging with experts in their fields, and I'll be introducing tonight's experts shortly. I appreciate this afternoon's event might be a sensitive one, especially in light of the recent pandemic. However, we cannot deny this is a timeless challenge, and I question, should we see it as a challenge at all? Some comments and ideas might ruffle some feathers today. However, we are here to understand how we can better cope with death, or even flourish in its inevitability. By way of a brief agenda, today's event will start with detailed opening comments from our speakers before we start our manthan, or discussion. This will be for around 30 minutes and will be followed by about 20 minutes of audience Q&A. Given the time and topic, we are by no means here to reach clear-cut answers tonight. But in order to have a robust and a valuable discussion, whilst applying the Dharmic lens, we will in parallel want to gauge the current societal status quo on this matter. This most certainly will be where we need your contribution as we turn the topic today. So I invite you to engage with the discussion by posting your comments and questions to me via the YouTube chat function. If you enjoy today and would like to know how to get more involved or simply to hear more about our events, then I will be sharing that information with you a bit later during my closing comments. For now, to start today, we have a panel of speakers to bring our conversation to life. We have Dr. Ramesh Pattni, as a psychologist with an OBE for his voluntary work in interfaith relations and community services in the UK. He holds a doctorate from Oxford in yoga psychology and teaches this topic at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. His particular interest is in psychological concepts and practices of the ancient Hindu texts for the application in mental health well-being. And he has extensive experience in spiritual guidance and counselling. A warm welcome to you. We have Divya Prabha, born and raised in the UK, an Oxford graduate who, after working in investment banking, was inspired to embark on a spiritual journey. She is now an Acharya in Yoga, a PhD in Sanskrit, and is the founder of numerous NGOs supporting Sanatana Dharma, Sanskrit, and Yoga as a way of life. Divya Prabha, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me too.
We also have Sidharthji, who, having memorized the Gita by the age of 6, became a spiritual master and teacher of Indian philosophy, covering Advaita Vedanta, Patanjali's Yoga, and Sanskrit. A warm welcome to you as well.
Thank you very much, Daksha, for having me.
To open today, I'd be grateful if each of you could take a few minutes to share your initial thoughts on the topic. So, Sidharthji, please could you set the scene by explaining the Dharmic perspective on death and dying?
Thank you very much, Daksha. Dying is inevitable, but fear of death is not. Because we can learn to leave the body peacefully. In fact, the last 4 mantras of the Isha Upanishad, the first Upanishad, are all about this. They talk about oneness with omnipresent consciousness, because in the Dharmic perspective, death is seen as merely losing one's individuality, you could say limited or finite identity, one's particular form and name, but like a river which flows into the ocean and in the process loses its individuality, its limited identity, its particular name and form, but in response, it gains the limitless, the infinite identity of the ocean. The same thing happens as a person leaves the body in the understanding of the Upanishadic teachings. This is why death is seen as a great teacher. In fact, death is the teacher of one of the Upanishads, where the student, while addressing him, tells him that there cannot be a greater teacher than him. In fact, the more I think about it, I feel that there can't be a greater teacher than death, the ultimate reality of every living being. When we are faced with the death of a loved one, so many questions arise. Sometimes insights come. Moments of tremendous insight and understanding arise. I see this when I visit cremation grounds, how people are talking to each other. There seems a lot of knowledge and understanding and wisdom flowing there, but the only sad thing about that is that the moment we leave the cremation grounds, we forget it. We forget it too soon. This is why sometimes it is referred to as cremation ground detachment or cremation ground knowledge. So this is a very natural occurrence in our lives. Dharma takes this a step further, investigates it, tries to understand it, and then tries to find a method through which it can help us find meaning in life. This is how I see it in very short terms.
Thank you, Sidharthji. Rameshji, if you could now share your thoughts and touch on how maybe the British Hindu community approach death and dying as well.
Thank you. So I need to kind of explain the context in which we can begin to think about it. And we are talking about the British Hindu community. And therefore we got a British side of it, as it were, and we got the Hindu side of it. So living in a culture which brings in the British, Western, modern, postmodern perception and experience of death, and then the Hindu perception and experience of death, and how these two kind of hold a tension for Hindus in this country. So let me start by British, Western, modern, postmodern perception experience of death. Number one, how is identity constructed? In other words, that how do I see myself as this individual existing within society, within community, within a framework of system of thought? And that construction is created by me having certain beliefs about myself, about the world around me. That's number one, a creation of one's identity. Number two, there is a trend towards increased identification with the body. And this is what I show the world. This is what the world sees of me as this body. And this is the culture of the body. And this, as we know, is a huge industry which is based on the body. So a movement towards identity, a movement which is constructed, which takes body as a central aspect of one's self. Number three, shrinkage of the scope of one's sacred life and meaning. In other words, the sacred part, the spiritual part is kind of pushed out of this picture, leading to a sense of privatization, the experience of death and loss of a meaning within which the framework of his experience of death is then begin to be seen. So these three things we can think of as this British Western kind of way of locating death within the experience of individuals. If we then turn to the Hindu perception and experience of death, and this is what we find in the UK, is that thinking of death within the framework of Dharma. and I'm sure my colleagues will explain it much better than I can. But within the framework of Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha, how are these actually shaping my day-to-day transactional life in such a way that the word moksha comes into my thinking and in my choices on a day-to-day basis? So the question here is, we've got a tension between a Western kind of way of thinking about things and the Hindu way of thinking. And this tension between the Britishness and the Hinduness of life and the implied word in moksha, death as well, how do we then negotiate ourselves within this? And if we then look at, what are the consequences of moving towards the British way of thinking and functioning, and what is the consequence of moving towards the Hindu Dharmic way of being and living, and then what do we gain, what do we lose? And this is where the central question really is not it's not really can Dharma help us to deal with death, because this is the central concept in Dharma, is to be able to deal with death through a certain way of living. So the question is then, how is my living in this dharmic way going to affect the way in which I negotiate my relationship with death? And this, I think, is the kind of important framework for me to think about. Where is the place of Hindus in the British UK society in relationship to death, given the confluence of Britishness and Hinduness? Thank you.
Thank you, Rameshji. And finally, Divya Prabhaji, I appreciate you're in India currently, but having grown up as an English woman in the UK, I'd like to hear your opening thoughts. If you could also touch on how the British community approach death and what informs that community in their relationship with death and dying.
Pranam, it's obviously a fascinating topic, because the first and foremost part of British life and the concept of death is that life is a finite existence, the concept that there is just this one life. And so we see that idea or being played out, for instance, when, for example, people suffering from cancer who have been told that it's terminal, you see this concept of this bucket list, that they must do all of these things before they die. And all this very idea of this bucket list is completely tied into the finite concept of life and death in itself. And you see people doing everything they can to get as many worldly pleasures filled in and completed before they leave the body, in the instances where they know that they're going to be leaving the body, and the idea of the last meal, which they keep repeating and repeating until that very end. So it's a very self-centered, nature-driven concept as they go towards death. And then, of course, you've got the other part of society where death comes as a surprise when it is not age-related. So wherever death might be coming in life, that does affect how people approach life in general, in that there is the idea of here and now must be enjoyed to the best of my ability and my means at every moment, because one day I'm going to be dead and I'm not going to be able to do it later. And you also have then the different types of communities, the people who might be more religious, who have the idea of hell or heaven after death, which also affects how, though that affects those kind of communities, how they're going to live their life towards death. Because of course, the very fact that we've been born, the one thing that we can be certain of is that there's going to be a death of our own and of those around us. And the only question is when it will be, and whether others will be before us or after us. And so that is the only thing that affects the interrelationship between the communities, but the very fact that it's finite is, I think, a very limiting factor for the people of how they get to live their lives. And then when the death actually comes, then you see the different communities celebrating in different ways. Of course, generally speaking, there's no rule about whether it will be a burial or whether it will be burnt, with how many days it must be. There's total freedom to deal with how you deal with the aftermath. Some people have a wake, some people prefer to mourn in private, and you see different ways that people deal with death is very different where there is a finite understanding of life and death, because for many people it's the be all and end all, and it's very difficult for them to carry on with their lives without those various people. Then you see communities like the travelers communities celebrating the life as their community members have left the body with big processions and bands. So it's very different when you look within the British community as well, according to their historical traditions of how they're going to deal with it themselves. And you have those family ceremonies where people want to keep it very, very small because the family members just aren't able to cope mentally with the loss, whether it's sudden or expected. So the big question, is that the body has gone, but the love continues, no matter whether you're coming from the British community or the non-Hindu community or Hindu community. And so that is like, I think hopefully for the future, a question that in the British community becomes more and more important is how the body dies and yet the love continues. So the finiteness of the experience of life in the West, I think, is what makes it much harder for the communities without traditions like the travelers or the Hindu community, a lot harder to deal with the passing of a loved one than other communities might face.
Thank you, Divya, Prabhaji. They were really, really helpful comments from all three speakers. And I think that will really guide our conversation. What I've got from these opening comments is, a real agreement between, for example, Ramesh and Divya Prabhaji, that our school of thought and our philosophies do guide how we deal with death. So for us to reflect in particular on how Dharma can teach us, kind of allows us to say that would be a useful thing to do, because it does guide our relationship with death. And drawing on what you said, Divya Prabhaji, around the different ways that people navigate that situation, it's resonating in terms of how maybe in certain cultures we celebrate the life at a funeral, for example, and in other cultures we celebrate the onward journey. So this is really reflecting how we celebrate. But I think it is from our market research. So as we put this event on, we did try to reach out to our followers and ask how they're feeling. And actually at this moment, I think I'd be really grateful to hear from the audience as to what your thoughts are on our opening comments and the topic itself. But what we've heard from before is that a difficulty at the moment across the board is just even speaking about the topic, having a dialogue of death. And if I can ask you first, Divya Prabhaji, in the British community, from your experience, would you agree that it's a taboo topic? And if you would agree, what do you think is playing a part in creating that difficulty or that avoidance of the topic?
Really, taboo is the right word. And my own experience and what I've seen through life is that when there's been a death, a lot of people don't know how to approach the person who's lost a loved one. And sometimes people who are very disconnected from their own emotions, disconnected from the community as a whole, can be very fearful of an emotional outburst in front of them from the person that they've asked, how are you dealing since your father left the body, for example. And this small family units and the increased tendency in modern times of people living alone, the isolation that also brings, and also then the current situation where you've had these multiple lockdowns, it's left people feeling very disconnected, not sure where to turn, who they can talk to. And the classic British stiff upper lip leaves people sometimes just not knowing what to say to comfort someone in front of them, either at the end of the phone or on a video, or and also something I think that is very difficult for Westerns in the current time is to deal with death and not be able to hug each other, where one friend has lost a loved one. It's very difficult because hugging has been I know this is a strange thing to say, but hugging is a real means of communication between people in the Western society, and removing that as a consoling tool, I also think it makes it even more difficult for people to communicate and to express that their loss, leading to longer term grief. One thing that I've seen in the West in my own life was my grandmother for 20 whole years daily wept for the loss of my grandfather. Daily she wept for him. And yet my mother, how she dealt with it, is one day she was very upset about losing her father, and she had a divine experience of like this light coming around her and enveloping her. So it's very since people are in the older generations not so good at communicating, it becomes an even worse experience when someone has lost someone, because there's not a community network to support you in the way that other communities might do.
Thank you. That was a really good start, I think, to this month-in, because it's so relevant right now. The kind of scenarios that you described with the normal tools that we might use to connect are not possible at the moment. Rameshji, on this same topic, I'd really be grateful for your thoughts on how are we dealing, like, would you agree that it is a taboo within the British Hindu community about talking about death? From your experience as a counsellor, psychologist, would you agree with this? And if so, what is it about our specific scenario? You alluded to that earlier around sort of the adaptation we've had to make. That what is the reason for that, if you would agree that it is a taboo subject in the community?
Mm. Yeah, I think there are two things which I would like to say. First of all, is that if we look at the kind of model of grief in terms of psychological terms, so strictly speaking from a psychological angle, and of course these are Western models which are based on the research which is done with people who are grieving. And the first stage of grieving process is denial. Now that denial then turns into depression. Depression turns into negotiation. Negotiation turns into acceptance. Acceptance turns into adjustment. So briefly, that is the kind of stages one goes through. And like Divya Prabha mentioned, that sometimes one of the stages becomes so prolonged that you keep on grieving and denying even over a very long period of time. Now, if denial is the first stage of the grieving process, it means even before, we tend to shy away from talking about death and thinking about death. And I'll tell you what, and I'm sure Sidharthji will also agree with that, is that Yoga Sutra mentions the Panchaklesha, the 5 afflictions of one's individuality. One of them is called Abhinivesha, which is the fear of annihilation. And if we talk about the kleshas, we are talking about the drivers of our experience. So these are the drivers of our experience: avidya, raga, dvesha, asmita, and abhinivesha. Now, if we think that this kind of fear of death is one of the drivers in terms of our individual experience, it means that we are going to start running away from this thing called death. We don't want to think about it. No, don't tell me anything about it. I don't want to know about it. Actually, I would rather not even speak about it. Why? Because it creates such an agitation in my mind, a certain sense of anxiety. And that anxiety makes me to say, I don't want to experience this anxiety. I would rather not talk about it. So therefore, I think there is a natural response, whether you're a Hindu or any other, come from any other kind of background or culture, there is this fear of death. And if we then go to think about what is the kind of dharmic connection with that in dealing with it. So yes, the Yoga Sutra has actually given us the driver of our experience in terms of this fear of annihilation, but it has also given us a solution. And that solution is what we need to look for in terms of Hindu community. Is it looking for the solution from the dharmic perspective to deal with some of the anxieties and some of the challenges which arise when confronted with death? So yes, there is this anxiety about death. And I know that one of my friends actually called me, one of my students, and she told me, look, I'm completely overwhelmed because both of my parents are in hospital. I'm calling you, I'm sitting in my car, I'm calling you, and I don't know what to do. And my mind is so agitated. And I know that this may be the final time I'm going to see them in the hospital. After that, unfortunately, both of them passed away. Imagine losing 2 parents at the same time. And she was so overwhelmed. And she says, I don't know what to do. I have some idea that my parents wanted, this kind of way of going through the rituals, taking the dharmic pathway in terms of dealing with death. And I have no idea. And I don't know what to do. And that causes another layer of anxiety for me.
Thank you, Rameshji. And I really appreciate that real life example. I think it brings it to life. On that point then, Sidharthji, what I'm hearing from the recent comments is, similar stories between the wider British community specifically, and also, the Hindu community here. And possibly I could say then it might be an inherent human condition to avoid such a topic, which Rameshji shared with us, that it seems to identify that in the Dharmic scriptures. It identifies the various afflictions and positions that we take on death, but equally that there might be a solution. If I could ask you to share with us what is the Dharmic perspective on the human condition, and more specifically, does it paint a picture of what an ideal relationship with death is?
Yes. Maybe student-teacher relationship, because we can learn a lot by thinking about death. When thinking about it, instead of worrying about it, to use it to learn how to live our life better in the light of the wisdom that we can gather by thinking about this inevitable reality. Dr. Rameshji was talking about the anxiety. For example, here in India, when someone passes away, the family encourages the beloved ones to recite the Bhagavad Gita, to study the Gita, because Gita gives us the opportunity to discuss death. This is something that we should have done long before even someone passes away. This is something we should have done all our lives, but at least in those moments, it's somehow, I see that in families, gradually then things calm down, people come up, they have discussions, and they find methods to relieve their anxiety. So if contemplated properly, it can not only give us peace in such moments of loss, but then also provide us proper orientation in life, what to do in future, and help us find our meaning in life. It can reorient us as to what is really, truly meaningful in life. It can make us aware of our own impermanence, which then reduces attachment to unnecessary things and distractions, and then may inspire us to find ourselves. I see more and more, I mean, even here in India, it's getting a taboo topic. Not everyone wants to talk about it. And I often say that sadly, we live in a positivity obsessed culture today. Sometimes I think some negativity is also very good for health. Personally, I don't see why such a wonderful topic should be a taboo. By treating it as a taboo, we are depriving the society from potential wise men and women like the Buddha. His father tried everything to hide old age and death from him. This is what our society sadly is trying to do now from all of us. Had his father succeeded, we would not have had someone like the Buddha. And the same goes for the Buddha himself says that all the Buddhas before him and after him, they go through the same experience. So, for example, even the Bhagavad Gita in the 13th chapter, it lists these 20 means of wisdom. And one of them is to analyze the suffering that takes place in death. So, which is seen by the Bhagavad Gita as a source of tremendous wisdom, not knowledge, but wisdom, direct understanding, which comes from within. So, I think it should be a topic that we more often talk about. I would go as far as saying that awareness of death is the very foundation of all deeper spiritual practices. It is the foundation of, it can become the foundation of our righteousness. If we haven't developed this awareness, then when it comes to deeper yogic practices, I don't know how helpful they are in the absence of this awareness. So speaking out about it, in fact, some of my friends, one of my very dear friends recently told me that one of the things that she really regrets is that she did not have an opportunity to talk with her father about death. This is what I've heard. And the same thing from so many of my friends. So I think we should encourage, and my father at least, from very, I think I was 5 or 6 or 7 years old, we had very open discussions. He took me, when somebody passed away, he took me there. And even if I was anxious, he told me the other side. He tried to calm me down. We had long discussions about it. He made me touch the body even, which is, by the way, not very uncommon here in India, maybe in the West, I don't know how it is now, but here. So he made me even touch the body, just so that I know the truth, I see the truth. And I think this has been a big relief. It doesn't sadden me. It doesn't make me sad. On the contrary, it makes me aware of the impermanence. It helps me embrace it and go beyond from there.
Absolutely. Really fantastic examples. have a personal experience, but equally, you know, the Buddha story is a very common, well-known story. To draw that parallel to ourselves, I guess, is the point of that story continuing through time. To really see what I hear you saying is exposure, not avoiding, and then being comfortable with what might seem discomfort, but to see its value. I mean, we can see what happened in these stories. People were flourishing out of that practice. That's really, really helpful. Thank you. I mean, Rameshji, what are your thoughts? Sidharthji has painted a picture of an ideal relationship with death, but from a psychology perspective, what is a healthy relationship with death from that angle?
So from the psychological angle, we often talk about two approaches. One approach is that how do you develop coping skills? Now, coping skills are to do with change. So we all go through various different kinds of changes. You know, life changes every time. Life is very complex in terms of the changes produces in our lives. And one of the biggest change is one of loss. And this loss is experienced right from the time we are born, right up to the time we actually go away from here. And loss can be of many different types. It can be a physical loss of losing some person, a very significant person in our lives. And that can happen even when you're a child. So that kind of loss is a loss of a person, a significant person in your life. It can be a symbolic loss. Symbolic loss means I have lost this person I was, in love with for so many years, and all of a sudden this relationship has gone upside down, and I've got, cases which I can quote in terms of how that can happen all of a sudden. And that symbolic loss of a relationship can put somebody into a deep state of depression. So losing is part and parcel of our life. How do we come to terms with it? First of all, by learning how to cope with this kind of changes and losses which occur and which are bound to occur. And even teaching children how to use these coping skills to face change and challenge in their life. Second approach is how to build resilience in your life. Resilience is this capacity in which you are able to face the challenge and face it in such a way that you bounce back immediately. This is just like the rubber band. You stretch it, and you leave it. At once it comes back to a state of normality. And this reminds me of what Bhagavan Shri Krishna talks about in the Bhagavad Gita. He talks so much about equanimity. The equanimity of mind, which is developed through a dharmic process and a dharmic technique, so that it brings immediately to, facing the challenge, getting over it, and coming back to a state of samatvam and equanimity of the mind. So resilience, coping skills. As far as we are concerned, psychologically speaking, from the Western tradition, we can teach these skills of coping and resilience, but at the same time, those were written 7,000 years ago in the Bhagavad Gita, when Arjuna himself has an existential crisis right in the middle of the battlefield because of death and dying. And the whole kind of Bhagavad Gita is a guidance as to how you can reframe your experience in such a way through the spiritual lens, so that you become extremely resilient and you've got all the coping skills you need.
Excellent. Thank you for that insight, Rameshji. We are about, I think, 15 minutes away from our Q&A, so we've still got plenty of time to continue this manthan. But I wanted to take this opportunity to ask the audience their thoughts on what they think a healthy relationship is with death. Do you have one? Do you not? Do you want to build one? I'd really like to hear those thoughts in the chat. And this is an opportunity for you to share your questions with us. We are collecting those, and we'll pose as many as we can during the Q&A. Divya, Prabhaji, if I could now ask you to draw on your own experience. I'm aware from our previous chats, firstly, you shared before that when you first took on this spiritual journey, you were asked to meditate on death, and I'd love to hear a little bit about what that involved. I think it speaks to what Sidharthji was saying about exposure. And maybe if you think that had an impact on you, when you compare to your experience of death of loved ones before your journey and after, if there's anything you can share with us on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was quite an extraordinary thing, very near my sort of start of the sadhana practices. I was asked one day to meditate on what death is. And what happened was that I was sitting on a triangle in the space surrounded by infinite divine space. And at one moment, I jumped off that triangle into the abyss of death. And what I experienced were two things. One was purification, that death is purification. But the other thing is, as I sort of inched up to the edge to drop off the edge, I remember that I had no idea what was going to happen, what would happen when I did that. And when I did do that, what happened was I experienced being spread out in the whole space. That there was no individuality there, and there was just everything. There were no limits. That was what I experienced. And that led me, one, to no longer fear death. Not that I particularly feared death, because my life was a little bit different from ordinary little girls in the UK for some reason. But I did, as I experienced death before that, I didn't really understand what death was. I remember when I was 6 years old being told that my godmother had died. And what I understood was that eating too many lemons meant that she was no more. And I didn't know what that meant, no more. And then as I went through life, as various grandparents left, I didn't really have any understanding whatsoever, nor any judgment. What was just that they were now no longer here. I didn't consider what was happening to them afterwards. But once I started spiritual practice and having an understanding of the Gita and Patanjali and the Upanishads, and this experience that I had in meditation, it opened a whole new infinite experience of that death is just like changing a set of clothes, that today I'm wearing this and tomorrow I'm wearing that, in the same way that today I am a person who was born in the UK and I currently live in India, and before that I was something else, and if there's another life it's going to be something else. And so that takes away, one, the whole pressure of an individual life or what you must attain in a particular life, but also a greater, also no fear, and also a greater awareness of how to deal with anybody's loss around us, which is inevitable. And the one thing, as I said before, if you're born, you're certain going to be dead. And also the incredible thing of that pretty much the majority of children in this world are going to experience the loss of their parents, which is it's an inbuilt system that most children are going to experience the death of their parents. And how, through different cultures, you approach that is an incredible thing. So I'm very grateful for having this spiritual practice, to have been able to deal with that in my own life.
Thank you, Divya Prabhaji, for sharing that personal story. I think this would be a good sort of time to come on to then how we could possibly build that healthy relationship for ourselves as a community. So Rameshji, excuse the siren for a moment. Rameshji, there are obviously many practices, rules, rituals that we do apply in modern society when someone passes. And I'd really like to now get into this, to understanding whether, in your opinion, whether they're still sort of fit for purpose. What are your thoughts on that?
I think if we start thinking about ritual, what is a ritual? and what is the function of a ritual, right? And in terms of death and dying, we know that there are ceremonies which take place just before death, there are ceremonies which take just after death, and these are ceremonies which are to do, on the one hand, with psychologically dealing with those who are left behind, but also it is a symbolic kind of representation of what is going to happen to the soul who has departed. So there is a whole set of rituals which take place during this time, before death, during just after death, and even 1 year later. So there are rituals which celebrate the passing of the soul, giving the departed one various different things for them for the onward journey towards Pitraloka. Now, how does that kind of fit in terms of the psychological way of thinking? And I think it's absolutely relevant. And when I was talking earlier on about, the privatization, the kind of sanitization, and the kind of secularization of death, which, the Western society is moving towards, what we lose in terms of ritual is that we lose this close connection and engagement with death of our beloved one, which does not allow us to process our own grief, process the way in which we are going to kind of help the departed one on their journey forwards. And that is part and parcel of our Dharmic way of thinking. So, for example, when Divya Prabha was mentioning about, in the Western way, we think about opposing of life and death. But in our Hindu tradition, we talk about birth and death. This kind of opposition of life and death is an indication that we are focusing on life, and in relationship to that is death. Whereas we talk in terms of birth and death because of the continuation of the cycle of birth and death. And therefore the ritual is very important in terms of acknowledging that there is a transition which takes place. You are helping the departed to make the transition by doing the right rituals. At the same time, it is taking care of the family who is left behind so that they kind of go through this process of grieving, psychological adjustment. What I was telling you about that in my counseling, I tell, my clients that, this is how you got to kind of navigate yourself through your grieving process. Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of performing the rituals, it gives us a solid basis on which this can be done through the whole process, before, during, and after. And if it is taken care of then that way, then we come to a right relationship with death. We come to a right relationship with our own emotional and personal processes, and make sure that everything is taken care of. And that was really the beauty of these rituals, which allows this whole process in a collective way to process this grief.
Thank you, Rameshji. Just to ask you a bit further, so I completely appreciate from what you're saying that this structure, this support structure, this way of doing things is available to us, and it seems to be curated beautifully based on the philosophy and the condition, the human condition that Dharma has identified. But practically speaking, in the context in which our community is living in, the inevitability of the different influences and reality of modern life, yes. Does it stay relevant in its current form, or is there, what else could we be doing is it still useful? Does it still work? What more can we think about there?
Yeah. I mean, of course, it does work in the way in which I was describing. The question here really for me is that, is there a disconnect between me being a Hindu and not knowing what the ritual is for, and not having the knowledge why it is done? And this lady who came to me and said, look, please explain to me, what are these rituals? How are they done? What is the process? How do I get in touch with the Pandit? How do I know this Pandit is going to do it in the right way? And she was kind of very anxious about this whole situation. Why? Because she had no idea. Mm-hmm. I'm a Hindu. I do not know these rituals. I do not know what happens. I do not know the significance of these rituals. And therefore this disconnect between having this sense that I'm a Hindu, but not knowing what is there to be done. So that is one gap which we got to try and address. Secondly, even while I'm sitting in the ritual itself, what is my understanding of that ritual, and how am I kind of processing my own thoughts and feelings while I'm in the ritual itself? And therefore, we need a context and a way in which that can be done, so that the Pandit is explaining to me each and everything in English. Why? Because if you're 19 years old and 45 years old, it is very unlikely that you'll understand any Sanskrit at all. And I think majority of the people don't. And therefore, to understand the ritual as it is happening in terms of our own kind of understanding as British Hindu, then that also makes this whole thing relevant, and it makes the ritual itself very powerful.
Thank you, Rameshji. On this same topic, drawing on Rameshji's answers, Divya, Prabhaji, from your experience or knowledge of Dharma and of applying this school of thought to death and dying, one thing I noticed here from Rameshji is the anxiety of having to deal with this at the last minute, so maybe a lack of preparedness. But specifically what he was saying around not understanding the meaning of the rules and rituals that have been put in place to address our concerns. Would you agree that it matters or doesn't matter if we know the meaning? Does it work regardless? What are your thoughts on that? If the purpose is to support the soul on its onward journey, if I've understood correctly from Sidharthji's explanation.
I believe that it truly doesn't matter if you have an understanding or not an understanding of the rituals or the language itself. One reason is that Sanskrit as a language is not a language, but rather a divine vibration that has an impact that you can feel even without understanding the words. Now, I understand what Dr. Rameshji is saying in terms of the person wanting to connect to the ritual, but there's two levels on which any person can connect. One is where it's on the intellectual and the mental level, where they understand each of the steps. But at the same time, there's an energetic process in these rituals, which are thousands and thousands and thousands of years old, unchanged, which have simple things in it, like the Sanskrit mantras themselves, which are working on an energetic level, moving the elements into their own elements, for example. And then on the physical level, in terms of the materials being used, that are incredibly practical. For instance, in India, they still use mango wood as the favored wood to burn a body. Why? Because it burns at a higher temperature than the other woods, in ensuring that all of the remains are able to be going into ash. So if someone wasn't interested in knowing what the meanings was and doesn't know what the meanings are, I wouldn't be concerned that their relative isn't going to have the proper process and won't benefit from it. Because at the end of the day, all of these things are completely energetic.
I think I understand what you are saying, Divya Prabhaji, but I think that there is a personal element which is there. And I think, okay, so in terms of the process which is taking place and the journey onwards of the soul is being taken care of, yes, there is that part of it. And, I understand the energetic part and the kind of intellectual part as well. But I think for the person who is sitting down and kind of just mechanically trying to do the things which are being done, somehow doesn't give the time for them to, or the opportunity or the capacity to process whatever is going on. So that when, for example, the Pandit is saying, okay, now here's the ladder, which this ladder is going to be useful in terms of your connection with the departed one, and therefore it is giving them the opportunity to move on. And that particular kind of thought process and the emotion behind it, when it is understood and it is processed, I think it can have a powerful effect. So
I quite agree.
Yes. So I think, it is important to have an understanding really what is going on.
Thank you, both of you. That's, I think, invaluable to understand both sides of that coin, to say that what is offered there in terms of rules and rituals is reliable on many levels, but to have the benefit for yourself, to really engage in the meaning behind it. And I wonder, I think, from the audience, do you personally engage with that level of the rules and rituals when it comes to this part of life? Do you think it matters? Does it not? Can you think of any other ways of achieving the same thing? Really would like to get your thoughts on how relevant that is today. Just to finish up before we go to Q&A, I'm really keen to hear from you, Sidharthji, on quite a poignant topic at the moment around approaching the end of life, and to have an understanding of how we could best approach it. I think at the moment, from what we've seen lately, and I think for a long time, often there is a sort of a panic stations, a desperation to keep your loved ones alive. I'm not suggesting that it's right or wrong, but I'd love to hear your perspective on what does Dharma teach us on a healthy approach to end of life. So just before you do start, I would like to just remind the audience that it's just after this we will have the Q&A. So if you've got any last questions, do put them in and we'll go to Q&A shortly. Sidharthji.
So I'll try to answer this question based on what I saw happening around me. First of all, my own teacher, the head of Kailas Ashram, passed away a while ago. So what I saw, what he was doing as he was ending. My father is now 90 plus, and I can speak from what, just in short, what he has been trying to do. So I think as soon as my father was more than 50 or 60, this phase of, because we have these four phases, Brahmacharya, Grihastha, Vanaprastha, and Sannyasa, which means, so first of all, the phase of studying, then the second phase of a householder, then the third phase where you take a more contemplative and meditative lifestyle, and then ultimately giving up all your possessions. So the monastic life. So what I saw is that, first of all, he worked on letting go what he saw as unnecessary possessions, reducing possessions, going into solitude, spending more and more time in peaceful places. And then ultimately, as part of sannyasa, to let go of the constructed notions of ourselves, which we have, because he always used to explain, he always explains that these two seem to cause the greatest anxiety during death. So if we have resolved these two before we pass away, we have already cleared a lot of confusion, many reasons of anxiety. So as a practical step, what he, for example, does is that he meditates quite often, which is also the way it has been described in the Upanishads, in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where he meditates on his own death and then on his own funeral. He does that quite often. And so, yeah, I think this is part of, again, talking a lot about it and preparing. He became very sick in 2008, and it was a very difficult situation. But I think he was already prepared 12 years ago, and ever since he has been very peacefully prepared, totally ready for whenever the moment comes through these practices. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that example. Yeah, it's definitely making me reflect on that part of my life and how useful these thoughts would be, this level of preparation
and of course, anxiety from my side as a son is certainly there. That's particularly now in these days, to save him from any kind of from this pandemic and all of that. So tremendous anxiety is there, but he resolves it all the time. Yes.
Thank you, Sidharthji. So we have now come to the Q&A section. So I'm just going to take a moment to read the questions that have come in. And let's see. So we have, gosh, so many questions. I'm looking forward to this. We have a question, a really good one, from Subha and Vichruti. The question is, and if I could pose this, to you, Divya Prabhaji, is there a certain age when mature talks on death would be applicable? And if so, what age would you advise? Also, do children have the ability to absorb such a topic like death?
The extraordinary thing is, I think that there's an element that very, very young children, before they develop their individuality and their notion of self-survival, are able to understand the spiritual process of death better than teenagers or people in their 20s and in their 30s. I think that in teenage time and 20s and even early 30s, I think that people, having gone through those age groups, are not really thinking about that there is such a thing as death in life. Yes, grandparents might come and go, but still parents are very much present. And so there's not much energy spent on thinking about one day my parents are going to be gone, or one day I myself are going to be gone. But once you start getting into that 40 age group, my experience is that there starts to be a new bond with the parents as you get closer in similar lifestyles, and you start to become realistic about one day my parents might not be around. Luckily for Sidharthji, he's had that very long process to be able to go through that. So going to the question, when would it be appropriate to be talking about death? I think that young people are much more able to talk about these topics than when I was a young person. I think that it's not unrealistic for that to be a module in school, in the classes about life itself and life decisions and things like that, which probably wouldn't have been possible when I was a child. And I think that by the as you go through towards the end of your 30s, most certainly by that time, you'd want to be able to sit down practically and talk about what life and death actually are, because it is approaching not just for your family members, but for you. And certainly by 50, I think that ordinary people are starting to think about what their previous phases of life are, and now how do they want to spend the rest of their life. And that comes part and parcel with the concept of death, for me, in my opinion.
Thank you, Divya Prabhaji. Very useful advice and insights, and I hope that the audience have found that useful. Subhaji, please comment if that did answer your question. We have another question. Gosh, so many. Which one should I choose? Rameshji, there is quite an interesting question here. If I could pose this to you, is there a Dharmic view, or what is the Dharmic view on the topic of euthanasia, the idea of ending your life consciously or with intent?
Yeah, I think we can talk about euthanasia, or we can talk about the other very difficult topic of suicide. And the kind of way in which I understand it is that there is this idea of the prarabdha karma. Is that if you think about that, we are born with a certain karmic unfoldment which is going to take continuously throughout our life, so that here is a portion of my karma which I have to work out during my lifetime. And if for some reason I take a conscious decision to end it in the way in which we are talking about here, then in a sense that I have to come back to think about how this remaining portion of my prarabdha karma is going to be dealt with. So therefore, there is a kind of a negative connotation around euthanasia, around suicide, around taking life in your own hands. My colleagues may have a much more deeper understanding of that.
Sidharthji, we were just talking about the Dharmic view on euthanasia, and specifically there's another question from Sharon as well that had extended that to suicide. Do you have any other thoughts on that to add to Rameshji's points? If you just unmute for a moment.
Yeah, this is something that has been discussed in quite detail in the Dharmic texts, particularly under which circumstances leaving the body, making the decision of leaving the body is appropriate. There won't be time to go into all the different complexities of that, but I think that some of the Dharmic texts certainly would agree that if a person is suffering from life-threatening disease and from a disease which is incurable, sorry, not life-threatening, but incurable disease, then to shorten the span of life with correct understanding was, at least in ancient times, quite acceptable. And this has happened, in fact, in places like Rishikesh, where people come for two things, sometimes under such circumstances, to leave their lives by entering Ganga, the sacred river, and in some cases also mindfully leaving the body, which means coming to Rishikesh, not to enter the Ganga, but just in old age, come here to be next to the Ganga, take their bath. I've seen cases where someone just took the bath, put on the tilakam, did his japa and meditation, and then lied down, just never to sit up again. So these type of things do happen here. I think that's all I have to say on this.
Thank you for adding to that with those useful examples. We have another question, Divya Prabhaji, from Sapna. The question is, should faith leaders be exploring and leading these conversations in our community? I think she's referring back to the topics that we spoke about earlier around maybe a lack of conversation or a need for more conversation. So what do you think, what's the role for faith leaders in the community in that regard?
Oh, completely. I think that the responsibility is with faith leaders, because the role of faith leaders is also not just a teacher, but is a counselor, is a handholder through life, through all the different stages of life. And those are the people who are best positioned from a knowledge perspective and a relationship perspective to realistically talk at your level about the topic itself. So I can't think of a better group of people to talk with people and educate people and share the experience with the communities.
Thank you for that opinion, Divya Prabhaji. We have another question, that is from Rishi. If I can pose this to Rameshji. How can people, families who are uncomfortable about having these conversations, how can they practically initiate the conversations with their loved ones?
So, I mean, there is a kind of process through which one can begin to do that. And earlier on, Divya Prabhaji was mentioning about when do we start these conversations? And, I remember that when my youngest daughter, she lost the hamster. She had a pet hamster. And therefore, we had this conversation about death. Is that, here's something which was existing, came into existing, now it has gone out of existence. Look at it, feel what you want to feel, openly and honestly talk about the process of death, and then to take care of this little hamster, let's think about what we can do. So honesty, openness, in a way of initiating the conversation without any kind of defensive way of talking about it in psychological sense. And to have that conversation without any fear, because we know that the outcome of this conversation is going to deepen our understanding of death and how to respond to death, how to relate to death, and how to then bring that into the integral part of our thinking on a day-to-day basis. So as I was saying before, loss and all kinds of loss, we can even start talking to children about loss in this kind of way in which I was talking about. And the loss of a pet, the loss of a friend or something like that begins the conversation. And for example, if in my family, if there is somebody, my eldest daughter, she has lost somebody, that becomes an opportunity for us to talk about it. And as much as we are there to support, as much as we are to be honest about what our feelings are and what we think about it, as long as there is an openness about discussion and to contain that in the best way possible, brings about this conversation.
Thank you, Rameshji, and to all the speakers for answering the questions of our Q&A. We have actually come to the end of that time for Q&A, so apologies if we didn't get to your question. I hope we got to most of them. It now just leaves us to come to a close, really. There was so much in today's talk that I would have loved to have delved into a lot more. But if we can just maybe finish up with each of your closing comments on what you would like to leave the audience with regards to having a healthy relationship to death and dying. If I could ask Sidharthji to go first.
Thank you very much, Dakshaji. One of the first things that I would like to state is that death is not a one-time event. It is happening every moment in our life. New cells are created, old cells die. Today, the sad thing is that in our society, we have pictured death as something frightening. But death is only frightening for those who are left behind because it leaves a sense of tremendous loss in them. And they have to see the body, which might be a frightening thing to look at unless you have properly prepared it for looking at. But there is nothing frightening in death for the person to whom it happens. Most likely it is a very peaceful experience of falling asleep. I think Rameshji would agree that different types of NDEs, near-death experiences, out-of-body experience, seeing a dark tunnel with light at the end, or seeing a brilliant light, extremely soothing. These kind of experiences which have been well documented now by physicians like Raymond Moody. And also in the Upanishads, I talked about the last 4 verses from the Ishavasya Upanishad. I think they seem to refer to these type of experiences. So for the person going through it, it's not really a very painful or frightening experience. And this is why we see mystics like Kabir Dasji really preparing themselves and welcoming that inevitable moment. A Vedantin master would say very easily that there is no need to fear it because it is just going back to the state in which you were before you were born. So like the great wise man Vidura says to his brother Dhritarashtra that from the unseen, from the invisible, we have all emerged, and to the unseen or into the invisible, we are all going back. Why this lamentation? Why this anxiety? I think I would leave it here.
Thank you, Sidharthji. Rameshji, your closing comments, please.
So, as I said in the kind of opening comments, that we have to think about this confluence of two cultures. And my kind of view now is that if we are talking about the British Hindu community, then I would say look for ways of connecting again with Dharma, the understanding of our own philosophy, the understanding which gives a kind of support and containment, and develop a kind of relationship with death, which is going to flourish into a clear understanding about what life is, what death is, and how the understanding can not only help us to deal with death around us, but also to start contemplating about our own life and our own death. And I think Dharma is such a beautiful kind of way of not only understanding death, but to come into the right relationship with it. And if we think even about, the whole process of death and dying, what happens during the rituals itself, there is a whole kind of richness about the way in which all these are constructed and construed in terms of helping the individual. Just like Bhagwan Shri Krishna helps Arjuna in guiding him through this existential crisis of understanding death and dying. This wonderful text of the Bhagavad Gita, I can urge people to just, read that and begin to understand how to reframe their own life in terms of not only understanding death, but also understanding how to live a good life. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you, Rameshji. And finally, Divya Prabhaji, your closing comments?
So I think that the really important thing is to move the concept from this finite idea of death to this unlimited existence of life and death, and looking at not death as a standalone existence, but the pairs of the opposites, the death and the birth, and getting to a position in your life where you are equanimous between the pairs of opposites, getting to that position of stable wisdom as described by Sri Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. And through knowing yourself, through self-awareness, coming to understand what you really are, that you're neither born nor destroyed, and understanding that whilst that body has left in front of you, the love remains, and asking yourself the question of what it is actually then that you're loving that was in a physical form yesterday, is not in a physical form today, and yet that unending, complete love exists in that relationship. And the means to do this is through self-analysis, becoming stable, stable-minded, and working with your communities, having your community relationships and an understanding of your faith and of what Dharma actually is, and bring it into life, because it is the most practical toolkit in the world of all of the philosophies and things that I've seen in the world. Dharma is something that is completely practical, that can give you a good way, a happy way, a peaceful way to live life, and be able to deal with the concept of death in itself.
Wonderful. Thank you, Divya Prabhaji. In fact, what a perfect place to end today's month in, as we've reflected on what Dharma can teach us about death and dying. Thank you to all of our speakers for your contribution today, Divya Prabhaji, Rameshji, Sidharthji. It has been a pleasure to have you on our platform, and we do hope to host you all again in the near future. We've understood today how modern society currently relates to death and what Dharma can teach us about the importance of cultivating a healthy relationship with death, and crucially, how we might go about doing this. I also hope this event has enabled you, our viewers, to build an understanding of your own relationship with death. And I encourage each of you to take your thoughts and questions to family, friends, communities, and keep this conversation alive after we log off today. You can also continue the dialogue with us via any of the usual social media platforms. You'll find the links shared below. As I mentioned earlier, aside from joining our live discussions, there are also a number of other great ways to take part with VM. Firstly, there's our VM podcast series. And it's perfect for a long walk or a commute, and it's available across all the major audio streaming platforms, or at vicharamanthan.org/podcast. We also have our fantastic VM book clubs, which provide another great space to earnestly explore and discuss ideas. They happen across the country each week. For details on how to attend your nearest book club, just visit the website vicharamanthan.org/book club. I'd like to take this opportunity now to thank our well-wishers, without whom the work that we do would not be possible. If anyone watching would also like to support our efforts in this way, please use the QR code, it's just displayed on the screen, or you can use the link that will be posted in the comments section. Before you leave today, you can also subscribe to our channel just by clicking on the bell icon below. That will mean you're notified when each new discussion is released on YouTube. To hear about our events in advance, be sure to sign up to the mailing list, and that is also at vicharamanthan.org/mailing list. And finally, please diarise 7 p.m. Thursday, 29th of April, where we'll be back live on YouTube, hosting a fireside discussion, looking at the Dharmic perspective on sustainability. We look forward to seeing you on the 29th. Good evening and namaste.